Western cultures are dominated by a different way of being in the world.
Yeah.
There's a very famous anthropologist, Joe Henrich, he's actually the chair of cultural anthropology at Harvard. He describes Western cultures with a fun acronym. It's called WEIRD. Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich Democracies.
Amazing.
It's a great acronym because what he's found is that people from weird societies are only 12% of the world's population.
Wow.
And if you think about it, they dominate global companies, Western companies. It's like, so weird is a good substitution for the word Western. But what's great about the WEIRD acronym is that it's a reminder of what he says, weird cultures, weird personalities are some of the most unusual personalities in the world. In fact, much of psychological literature, so if you look at, he and his team did a study of the major psychology journals, and they found that over 90% of the subjects that are studied in psychology journals, major psychology journals, are weird subjects.
Oh.
It was like 92% of all the subjects that are studied in those studies. And most of them are undergraduate students.
Right.
So that's another even more specific subset. And yet we're making extrapolations about human nature based on these weird people. And what typifies weird cultures is the number one thing is they're incredibly individualistic. And also they tend to break down problem solvings in a very analytical way. Asian cultures, African cultures, Latin American cultures, and certainly Chinese cultures is a much more collectivist. So oftentimes we look at the world from the standpoint of we really want to contribute to a team. We really want to make sure that we don't make the person that we're talking to look bad.
Yes.
We're so respectful that way. But we're operating in a world, a weird world, where some of those same behaviors that we consider respectful, people will look at us and say, oh, this person has no ideas. Oh, this person has no leadership skills. And so I think it's, number one, the most important thing is to understand the unwritten rules of the game in Western companies. That's why I wrote, this book is sort of a free asset. It's just a 15-page book, but it's a small book to help people understand these cultural differences. So that, I think that oftentimes as I talk to other Chinese, oftentimes people say, oh, my company is so racist. Look, there's no Chinese at the top and we're 40% at the bottom. And I think to label something as racism is, yes, this isn't a general category of racism. I think of racial bias as more of like you look at somebody and you categorize them according to their skin color, and then you assign all these attributes to them. And there is that racism, but there's also a broader thing where even as people get to know us and they observe our behaviors beyond that skin deep look, there's still this gap.
Yes.
And where there is a cultural gap, there will be a gap in equity, right? So I think it's incredibly important because our companies are not fully inclusive of all cultures as they aspire to be. For people who are not members of the cultural majority, including especially Chinese, who tend to be the biggest part of the non-cultural majority in many places, and the most different, because in many cases, our behaviors, our cultures are the most different from the dominant culture. It's even more important for us to understand the unwritten rules of the game. So that would be the most important thing that I would say, that people start to really closely observe, like if you're in a meeting, actually, we can just sort of think of ourselves as a cultural anthropologist. If you're in a meeting, rather than just pay attention to the content of the meeting, really start to watch the dynamics and be like, who's the most influential person here? Why is that person so influential? What specifically is the source of their influence? How do they behave? How many times are they speaking in this meeting? What do they say? How do other people react to them? How do they react to the other people? And then we can also say, who has no influence in this meeting? And what is that person doing wrong? On a meta level, in addition to participating in the meeting, try to see what's really going on invisibly